What is the connection between an Ayrshire abbey, English monks, and the modern Olympic Games? Well, I'll tell you. The first monks at Crossraguel Abbey, a story you're about to hear, came from Much Wenlock in England. Their claim to fame was the establishment of the modern Olympic Games. I'm James Brown, an independent historical researcher based in southwest Scotland, and I have the story of Crossraguel Abbey to tell you. Crossraguel Abbey. The very name is a puzzle to people. If you read it just as you see it, you might say Crossraguel, but no, it's one of these puzzles. Easy way to remember, it rhymes with bagel. Crossraguel, bagel. It's a very unusual name in Scottish place names. In fact, there's only one other place that we know had the name Crossraguel, and that was near a town called Straven, which is again a trick for you. It looks like Strathaven, but it's pronounced Straven. And near Straven was a chapel, and I think the area now is simply called Chapel Now, and now being a rounded hill. But in early Ordnance Survey maps, it can be seen that the place was called Crossraguel. So this is a puzzle to us because it's a considerable distance. Straven is to the south of Glasgow and in Lanarkshire, and just how the two places got the same name is a puzzle. Even the origin of the name Crossraguel is a puzzle for people. Experts in such things back in the 19th century had great debate on what the origin of Crossraguel was, and that exists in about 42 different spellings. Crossragmo, Crossraguel, so many. I can't remember all 42, but a lot of those misspellings actually would have come from poor handwriting in ancient documents, and the things would be misread. The nearest guess we can have is that it was the cross of St. Riel. Riel, if we took it as Irish, in Irish Gaelic, Riel is regal. You also find it in Latin, it would be Regulus, Saint Regulus, Saint Rule. And that is a possibility because much of the southwest of Scotland, of course, has many place names dedicated to saints, most of whom came from Ireland. You know, there were so many that I mention of places like Kilkirn, at St. Kieran, for example. And in the case of Crossraguel, could it have been, there are several saints. This is where it becomes difficult identifying a particular saint. We have Kilbride in the Carrick area and many parts of Scotland, St. Bridget. And then you find but there was more than one St. Bridget, so which one was it? Anyway, in the case of Crossraguel, its story started about the year 1244, when the Earl of Carrick, Duncan the Earl of Carrick, and bear in mind Carrick was part of Galloway at this time, and Galloway, nasty people they were in league with England. In many cases, not entirely, don't want to castigate them. But Galloway was virtually an autonomous region, and it was troublesome to the Scottish kings. So one way of reducing their power was to hive off Carrick and put it into Ayrshire. And that was about 850 years ago, thereabouts. We'll call it 8 centuries ago. Now, the Earl of Carrick had his base at Turnberry Castle. Turnberry, famous then, and my goodness, very famous nowadays. And Turnberry Castle, sadly now, is just a few stones, but it can still be seen. There's traces of Turnberry Castle left. It's where we believe Robert the Bruce was born, although Lochmaben in the Frisia would argue that that's where Robert the Bruce was born, but that aside. So the Earl of Carrick gifts land of Crossraguel or Crossragmole and Soot Blaine to the monks of Paisley. And he gives them an instruction. He said, look, I'm giving you all this land, you'll get a lot of money out of it, but I want you to build a daughter house of the Order of Cluny. The Order of Cluny is a Benedictine order of monks, and Cluny is the heart of that in Burgundy, South Burgundy. Cluny was the most powerful religious house in Europe. Cluny, the Abbey of Cluny, was the biggest building in the world, never mind religious building. It was the biggest building in the known world at that time. Now it's 10% of its size. Sadly, in the French Revolution, it was stripped for building materials. But nevertheless, so Paisley, which was already of the Order of Cluny, the most northerly and the most furthest flung abbey in the Cluniac world, which had 1,200 religious houses throughout Europe. Paisley at the time was the 10th most powerful, 10th richest abbey in the Order of Cluny. A wonderful accolade. Paisley Abbey is a place worth visiting, I can assure you, and even has traces, architectural traces that you might find at Baltersen through a particular French master mason.
Plus que toute autre église du Moyen-Âge, Cluny transpose dans l'architecture l'évocation d'un monde céleste. Des proportions jusqu'alors inégalées, des matériaux d'une richesse exceptionnelle, une lumière à profusion entre construction et ascension. La nef, avec ses 5 vaisseaux, apparaît dans une forêt de piliers, surprenant squelette de pierre aux chapiteaux ornés. L'architecture suit les codes de la liturgie et accompagne l'immense communauté réunie en de longues processions. La lumière éclatante contraste avec la semi-obscurité. Au loin, le sanctuaire, éblouissant de soleil. Au sol, un tapis de marbre où domine le rouge royal conduit vers l'espace de l'autel. Plus loin, sur la voûte de l'abside, trône le Christ de la fin des temps, annoncé dans le tympan de l'avant-nef. Réunis par la course quotidienne du soleil, les images se font écho de l'ouest jusqu'à l'est. Dans le déambulatoire qu'on disait digne des anges, les 8 chapiteaux offrent un programme d'images d'une très haute spiritualité. Plusieurs illustrent les vertus. Un autre porte les 4 fleuves du paradis. l'image du jardin d'Éden qu'Adam et Ève ont perdu par leur faute. La musique rythme la journée.
Anyway, at Crossraguel, the monks were the first monks to arrive at this new establishment actually came from England. They were sent up from England. They then become native, so to speak. After a period of time, they're gathering in their wealth from, I think it's about 8 of the 11 parishes or thereabout communities in the region, including coal. The monks of Crossraguel were burning coal at a very early period in time. They owned coal mines near a village called Daly, which actually became a mining village right into the 20th century. But way back then, the monks were burning coal. Now, you might think, so what? There was a famous man who became a pope. I think his name was Ayala, if I remember right. And that pope visited Scotland in medieval times. And as part of his report when he got home, he said, it's very strange in Scotland. They burn stones in their fireplaces, which of course was coal. Anyway, it's set up probably originally as a small wooden church, and then would develop into the other monastic buildings. And to this day, Crossraguel is the most complete medieval abbey in Scotland. Now, most people will know, those who are interested in such things will know the beauty of Melrose Abbey, which also has a connection with Crossraguel, or Kelso, or whatever. The beautiful, what we call border abbeys, the ones that were badly mauled by the English invasions at the time of Henry VIII, known by Walter Scott as the rough wooing, because Henry wanted Queen Mary to be married to an English prince. Scots resisted it, thank goodness. But anyway, the completeness is in terms of the component parts of abbey life. So the buildings are all mostly in ruin. So the components of abbey life, is most importantly, is the church, and the church is dedicated to the Virgin Mary. You have the refectory, the monk's dormitory, the abbot's house, and so on, the chapter house, the sacristy, and what have you. The abbot's house was built about in the 1480s or thereabouts. The present one, the tower house that we can see today, two of the sides, the north and the east side, have suffered badly from weather. What happens with these old stone buildings is in winter you get a thing called freeze-thaw. Very obvious, you get frost and snow or whatever clinging to the walls, and of course the east and the north sides don't get much sun. So that frost eats away at the mortar and the walls become weak and the walls fall down. The south and the west walls of that tower house are intact, right to the wall head, and the rooms and so on full of cupboards and what have you, which speaks of wealth. Still there. And they had flush toilets. I'll say flush to a degree. A very early development in all of these abbey sites and monasteries. The first thing they would do is build a series of drains. They were always built beside a stream, near a stream, so they could divert the water either for their mills or for the fish ponds, which historically we call stanks, and to flush out the toilets. And this happened at Crossraguel. But on each of the floors, so there's ensuite rooms, and again there's this hierarchy. At first floor level, if you had an audience of the abbot, but you were a bit of a stranger, you might have been allowed into that room. If you were more important, you'd be allowed to go up another level. And each time you'd be seeing more rich furnishings, tapestries and silver plate and gold and so on. And to protect their privacy, there was such a thing as a dumb waiter. Now, for those who've ever worked in hotels and such places, a dumb waiter is very simple. It's a little lift or elevator for the food. So the kitchens are down below, the dining room's up above. You don't want the servants walking up the stairs spilling the soup. So the food is placed in a little hoist. And they have such a thing in that 15th century Abbot's Tower house at Crushragel. So easy to miss, but it's there. Very thick walls at the base, 6 feet thick, to over just under 2 metres thick walls. Again, to carry the heavy, heavy weight of stone above. But that helps us to date buildings in these historic Scotland buildings. That the thicker the wall, the older the building, generally speaking. And the Kennedy clan's famous castle called Castle's House, which some people mispronounce as Cassilis. So if we're going to get Crushragel right, let's get Cassilis out of the way and call it Castle's House. The walls are about 14 feet thick at the base, astonishingly. Must have taken them about 2 years to build the first floor. But anyway, at Crushragel, you've got this lovely abbot's house detached. Now, the rule of St. Benedict was that the abbot was meant to sleep in the same dormitory as the monks. That almost happened at Crushragel because the older abbot's house is just a 2-storey building, and on that first floor there is a room with its own fireplace and a doorway through to the monks' dormitory. Now, why did they split? Where is all this poverty, chastity, obedience, so on, humility, etc.? The reason was very simple. The abbots in those days were the learned men. They were the men who could speak the different languages, whether it be Latin or French. They were often sent, and we know it, the abbot of Crushragel, William Kennedy, went on a pilgrimage to Amiens along with David Kennedy of Pennyglen and about 30 other landed gentry. They never went alone in pilgrimages, they went in a crowd, but he was actually going on diplomatic business for the king. And so he's privy to very high level security clearance. So they couldn't afford. Just imagine the situation if you had an abbot who's talked in his sleep or talked idly, and some gossipy monk picks up on it, and before you know it, the whole of the local village is getting all the gossip and tittle-tattle. So there was a good reason, but also who they were meeting. And we've got a good record at the beginning of the 16th century at Crushragel, where Georges Chauveau, from, let's see now, Bourbon, he was a servant to the Dukes of Bourbon in France. He was also the French king's master of arms. In other words, he was the top-notch diplomat for the French kings. Almost an equivalent, I think, of Henry Kissinger in the United States, who would travel the world and do negotiations on behalf of the American presidents and so on. Now, Georges Chauveau came to Crushragel Abbey in the early 1500s. He was on a mission to the King James, who had a foot in 2 camps. Burgundy was at war with Sweden. Oh, I should really learn these things before I speak. Burgundy is at war, and the Scottish king had family connections with both sides. So he was seen as an honest broker. And we have a good record through the Scottish King's Lord Treasurer's accounts of the movement of Georges Chauveau coming through, and Denmark gets brought into this as well. And in this situation, why did Georges Chauveau come to Crushragel Abbey? Very senior man. Why? Now we know he came because the king sent a messenger to Crushragel to the abbot saying, "Prepare for the visit of Georges Chauveau." Now, I think, probably pretty obvious, the Kennedys were the senior family in the region, and the Earls of Castles could command many men, many fighting men. And I think Georges Chauveau was sounding out a very senior person, probably to find out, are you still in favour of the French and so on. And at the time, yes, the Kennedys were supporters of Queen Mary, who comes after, of course, James IV and James V. But it was after Mary went into imprisonment in England that, sadly, the Kennedy Earls of Castles changed sides by the Reformation. But anyway, we've got this very important French diplomat visiting. His title actually was Montjoie, and translated into English as Mountjoy. And actually still, it's a common sort of name, I believe, in England, maybe Ireland as well, Mountjoy. In fact, I think there's a Mountjoy prison in Ireland. But Montjoie in French is a little joyful mountain. It's not really a mountain. Apparently, on pilgrimage routes, people would build a mound. In Scotland, we'd call it a cairn. You know, they'd build a heap of stones or something, and they'd create a mound with a cross and maybe even an arrow pointing, go this way. As one would find actually on the Camino de Santiago. And that's the origin of the name Mountjoy. But anyway, at the time of this man who was a servant to the Bourbons, he's actually, I think he's buried in a church in France, which was a Cluniac's house. So you've got a Cluniac's there at Crossraguel, and you've got the Cluniac French connection from the Bourbons. So here, one of the very famous visitors to the Abbey, a less welcome visitor or visitors to Crossraguel happened in 1306 when the English turned up with an army. Oh dear. They were besieging Turnberry Castle. Robert the Bruce at this time is hiding in a cave on the Isle of Arran, although some people say it was in Antrim, but nevertheless, it doesn't matter. So Bruce is still hiding from the English until some idiot starts burning waste material on the mainland, not very far from Ayr, I believe, and Craig Dhu, I think it's the Black Rock at the heads of Ayr, and this was seen by Bruce's followers from the Isle of Arran. It's about 12 miles from the coast of Ayr, and on a clear day, very visible. But anyway, they see this fire, and they say, Robert, come on, that's the signal, it's safe to come to Ayrshire. The English are hiding, they're out of the way, come on. Anyway, he turns up and finds a different story, but at that point, 1306 is really the real rising of Robert the Bruce, which leads on to Bannockburn, a very well-told, long-told story. So Bruce might have been born at Turnberry Castle, or at Lochmaben. We'll assume for the moment, for the sake of argument, he's born at Turnberry, then logically he would have been baptised in Crossraguel Abbey. We're talking about a 5-mile distance or 6-mile distance between the two places. He would have been educated by the monks. They were the learned people. They knew about medicines, they knew about growing food and the gardening and so on. They had all the knowledge. These were the knowledgeable people. And that early start, so to speak, for Robert the Bruce would have led on to others, later kings, and especially the Stuart kings, who became great benefactors of Crossraguel Abbey. And by a certain time, I can't quite remember the date, the Abbot of Crossraguel was honoured with the charge of 4 pleas of the crown. These are the 4 most serious criminal acts, such as murder and arson and so on. And that meant the Abbot of Crossraguel had the power of hanging people. And there is, about a mile away from the Abbey, 2 miles away, there is a place near the town of Maybole called Gallow Hill. And it would have been where the miscreants were put on public display as a warning to others. That power of the crown didn't get awarded to the mother house, Paisley, for another 80 years. So the abbots of Paisley were terribly jealous of Crossraguel, and they were very reluctant actually in the 13th century to give any power at all to Crossraguel. So anyway, here is an abbey that never had more than 10 monks in its history. That's a small convent, really, just 10 monks. Although, in the case of the Cluniac world, some of their priories had no more than 2 monks. And that would be pretty hard going if you fell out with your fellow brother. So one of the features that I've just mentioned there is the Abbot's Tower at one corner of the precincts of the Abbey. At the southwest corner, northwest corner, is another tower. And this is an entrance tower that was built in 1530. It had accommodation. It also had a beautiful arched entrance that a man on a horse could come through and feel very important and ride straight into the inner courtyard. Above it were 3 levels, 2 of rooms with ensuite facilities. They had their little toilets, just like the Abbot's Tower. They had the ensuite facilities, and then in the attic area, there was a 3rd level of accommodation. That, I think, again, this is my personal interpretation, would have been for important visitors, but strangers. So you just want to keep them at arm's length, the guest quarters, and just keep them at arm's length a bit, but nevertheless give them a level of accommodation that fits their status. That's a very beautiful building, very distinctive, but has a peculiarity attached to it. There is a turnpike stair, a wheel stair, that ascends to the different floors and right up to what one would call the battlements, so to speak, or the allure at the top, the wall head. It's like a watchtower. Because bear in mind, we're at 1530 now. In 30 years' time, 1 generation's time, is the Protestant Reformation. It didn't start in 1560. It was established in 1560. It started in the 1480s in a northern part of the middle part of Ayrshire called Kyle. And it was the Lollards of Kyle who really set the flames alight, get things going for the Reformation. They were getting Wycliffe's Bible and so on. So in 1530 at Crushrego, the warning bells are sounding. The Protestants are on their way, and it was slighted at one point by the iconoclasts, the damaged Paisley and the damaged Failford and so on their way coming south to Crushrego. But Crushrego had a wonderful big boundary wall, traces of which are virtually gone, but there are illustrations that show us this boundary wall, so it's virtually a castle. And the Earl of Castles at the time, well, they were the mafia. I'm paraphrasing, I've got no evidence of they were the mafia. No, they were very powerful barons, and you really would take your life in your hands if you upset them and worked against them. So I don't think there was much damage done to Crushrego by the reformers. And although they did a lot of damage, and even John Knox, the leader of the Reformation, John Knox himself did say in his writings, I think we went too far. In other words, we demolished too much, because they were smashing up statues, destroying stained glass windows and so on. There's almost no medieval stained glass windows left in Scotland, almost none. So nevertheless, here we have a place where the abbot is very powerful. They go on important pilgrimages, but treasure comes to the abbey. Wow. About 1548 or thereabouts, 1540s. As I say, the Reformation's getting stronger. And the Archbishop of Glasgow, I think maybe it's just the Bishop of Glasgow at the time, but anyway, Archbishop of Glasgow says to his friend William Kennedy, look, I'm getting worried. The reformers are getting closer. I'm going to send my treasure to you, if I may, please. You're my trusted friend. All the treasures of Glasgow Cathedral, by the way, most of the treasures, not Gavin's treasures, most of those treasures went to Paris, were never seen again, before the reformers could get their hands on them. But Gavin's treasure, and it's written down, I have the books, it's written down in the volumes behind me, that his treasure is recorded. It included furniture, fur garments, rings, gold, silver, cash. Probably the cash was, in modern terms, money, £2 million of cash. Where is it? Where did it all go? There's nothing in any local museum of all of that treasure. It evaporated. And it's a job maybe for some good historic sleuth to go looking for it. They might never find it, because obviously the gold and silver will be melted down and made into different things. The fur would wear out, the garments would be lost, the furniture would go on the fire when you're cold, as happened in so many historic houses. So that treasure came to Crossraguel because it was like a fortress. But as I say, it all vanished. The earlier times, that tower house, that gatehouse tower of 1530 is a significant date because that was the date of the death of Lady Roe of Balterson, the tower house not far from Crossraguel. Egidia Blair, from one of the big Ayrshire families, the Blairs of Adamton, which is now near modern day Prestwick Airport. Egidia Blair died as a widow, and I think a childless widow. And her last testament, her will, is extant, and it's a wonderful social document. And she gifted money here, there and everywhere to the different friaries and so on, and also money to build a pilgrim's bridge. I'd say it's definitely a pilgrim's bridge down near Girvan, and left money for it to be repaired as well. And it's a wonderful social document because she leaves money to lots of people in the Maybole area, and cousins and nephews, and even the poor crippled woman in Maybole. It's a nice touch. Her tomb can still be found in Crossraguel, but badly damaged as well. The tomb cover has the Blair coat of arms on it and a distinctive cross and so on, and an inscription saying that here lies the body of Egidia Blair, and gives the date of her death. That stone nowadays is actually a replica, a glass fibre replica. It's so valuable that it had to be taken indoors, so it's now resting in a cellar in Crossraguel. And her tomb would have had beautiful monumental carvings round about it and painted in beautiful colours. The position was a very favoured position against the north wall of the nave, the parish church, so to speak, the choir being the monks' private church. So against the north wall, and there's a window in the south wall, so when the sun reached that point, it would have shone straight down onto her tomb in its beautiful radiant colours. And people would have said, the sun shines on the righteous. Then, as the sun doesn't move around as we know, but when the sun is in the west, there was a window above the west entry to the nave, and that sun would have shone straight through and brought her tomb up in deep highlight of light and colour. Wonderful. And that sunlight also played another important part in the story of Crossraguel. On the belfry, which is the wall that separated the choir and the nave, on the belfry there is a window. On the nave side, it is above the roof. You can see the raggle of the roof on the wall. There's no roof anymore. See the raggle of the roof. There's the window. On the choir side, the window is below the roof. What does that tell us? It tells us that at 5:30, the time for Vespers in the Abbey, 5:30 p.m, the sun shone through that window and the light landed on the high altar. No accident. What days did it? It landed on the 1st of May, St. Mary's Day, the feast day of the Blessed Virgin Mary. But we all know on the other side of Midsummer, there's, I think, 9th of August, the light shines through. St. Blaine's Day. St. Blaine was a Scottish saint born in the Isle of Bute. Now Blaine, how does that come into the story? Why celebrate Blaine? The next field, the next farm south of, or to the west rather, of Crossraguel is Auchenblaine, Gaelic for the field of Blaine, now anglicised into a modern house, a 1930s house called Blaine Field, which is a direct translation from the Gaelic. And by strange coincidence, there was a very famous doctor called Blaine, and he was the surgeon who recognised that giving lime juice to sailors in the British Navy would help fight scurvy. But he was such a cold character, apparently, probably very aloof and cold-mannered. It was called Chill Blaine. So he's hundreds of years apart, this word Blaine comes into the story. But let's jump back to 1244. I mentioned that the Earl of Carrick gifted the land of Crushragmo, as it was spelt then in the document, and Suth Blaine, Suth, right? People misread that as South Blaine. On the map, there is no North Blaine. There's a field of Blaine. It's Suey Blaine, the seat of Blaine, who's a bishop. It's the seat of a bishop in Gaelic. So that tells us that Blaine has been celebrated, but it doesn't stop there. There's a third reference. Draw a line straight through that window, straight over the high altar to a point on the eastern horizon. And sunrise at that point is the feast day of Saint Uriel. Saint Uriel. Coincidence? Don't think so. Where else does rule come in? Kennedy's rule. Go to St Andrews. St Andrews Cathedral in its day was the biggest building in Scotland when it was complete. There is a wonderful, very tall square tower at St Andrews Cathedral called St Rule's Tower. Who was the most famous Archbishop there? Bishop Kennedy. Kennedy from the Ayrshire family of Kennedys. That Kennedy, James Kennedy, also built the Brig o' Doon, which many people will know if you study Robert Burns. There's a bridge across the River Doon, which we'd call in Scots the Brig o' Doon, not Brig a Doon, that's Hollywood, Brig o' Doon. And that beautiful single arch bridge, which stands to this day, was built by Bishop Kennedy to enable pilgrims to make their way and go over the Water of Girvan further south on a bridge built by Lady Blair of Balterson, who was married to a James Kennedy, and on to Whithorn, the most important Christian site in early Scotland. In fact, it was the first Christian site. It predates Iona by a long time. That is why Crossraguel Abbey is such an important site. It might be humble, low-level buildings, not finest carvings, which was actually a characteristic of the Cluniacs. The Cluniacs believed in offering God the best of everything: vestments, architecture, services, and so on. The Cistercians were the opposite. The Cluniacs had black habit. The Cistercians went the opposite. They had white habit. And the Cistercians believed in chastity, poverty, obedience. Who has got the finest abbey in Scotland? The Cistercians, with the most magnificent carvings. And we know that a Frenchman helped to carve them, because that Frenchman, Moreau, carved his name there and said his name, told us he was from Paris, and he was in charge of all the mason work in the south of Scotland, Galloway and Annandale and Paisley. He also must have stopped at Craigle to be the master mason there. Isn't that wonderful? In this humble little sequestered site, so much to be found, and you could say remains to be found. I hope you've enjoyed that story, and I will look forward to the next one. Thank you.